Okay, good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Okay, so let me give you the heads up of what we're going to do today, what's coming up after today. Think about it, we're into October. Next week's already the middle of October. Before you know it, the time starts flying by, and every semester, the same thing happens. When we get to the literature, the movies, the art, somehow or other, I have to like squeeze in everything at the end. I don't want to do that. So, because some of the really interesting parts of the course are coming up, some of the readings, the poems, and some short stories, really quite interesting. Some of the novels have movies that go with them, also quite interesting. And the artwork of World War One is also pretty compelling. So this is where we're going today. Moving along on the syllabus, we're going to talk about some of the battles of World War One. Now, obviously, in 4 years, there were a whole lot of battles. Can't do all of them. We already spoke about the Battle of the Marne, because that was in the very beginning, and because of the deadlock of the Battle of the Marne, the whole issue of trench warfare arose. And it also set the pace for a very long war. And in a very long war, a whole lot of battles. We mentioned in passing the Battle of Ypres, which is the first time that poison gas was used. So we spoke about some of these battles in passing, but there are three that I specifically want to talk about because you'll see why they're important. And in the case of two of them, well, actually three of them, there are, I have documentaries. Excuse me one second. I have documentaries to go along with them. We're going to see two of those documentaries today, maybe a third. Battle of Gallipoli and the Battle of Verdun. You'll see why these are important turning points in the war, how they're unique in terms of battles. So that's going to be the topic that comes up now. After we finish this unit on the battles of World War I, we're going to go on to the entry of the United States into World War I, which is a really interesting story. We avoided any kind of involvement for 3 years. And why we entered the war is maybe even more interesting, because we're going to talk about the sinking of the Lusitania, which was back in 1915, the Zimmerman telegram, which was absolutely incredible act of temerity on the part of the Germans. We'll hear all about that. It's absolutely incredible. But the Germans in World War I committed some really inhumane, to say the least, actions. We spoke about what happened in Belgium, and then we're going to speak about now the Battle of Verdun and what motivated that, and what the whole purpose and the intent of the Battle of Verdun was. So the U.S. entry into the war is coming up next, and different events that led to U.S. U.S. decision to send troops overseas. Then we move on to the literature and some very interesting novels, which we'll see the movie version of, and poetry. World War I produced a great deal of poetry, most of it from British poets who were themselves soldiers in World War I, and then the artwork that came out of World War I. Some really interesting and very poignant and moving pieces of art of various types, and a whole art movement that came out of World War I. Actually, a whole architectural movement also that came out of World War I. We'll speak about it in passing because there's an example of that movement in architecture right on the campus of Lehman College. So all in all, that's the direction in which we're going. I've mentioned also that next week I'll be posting the midterm. Maybe I'll post it on Monday. Monday actually is a holiday. I'll post it on Monday, so it would be due, let's say, late Wednesday. But I'll give you information and instructions also with the posting on an announcement. So, battles. One of the important battles of World War I was known as the Battle of Verdun, which took place in France. And it had like many of the incidents in the war, it had certain importance, significance of a symbolic nature, because the Battle of Verdun was an important battle in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. And now, once again, France and Germany are engaged in warfare, and the Battle of Verdun is a major event in that struggle. The whole strategy and the whole reasoning behind this battle actually can be laid to the German general Erich von Falkenhayn. And he decided that aside from the strategic importance of this battle, he saw another aspect of this Battle of Verdun, and it shows really the inhumanity of, one, the inhumanity of the German army. It also shows the desperation of the German army, because this war is just dragging on. And so for Falkenhayn, the point of this Battle of Verdun was not just to gain land, and to finally move from a state of stalemate, to move forward and gain some yardage or whatever. He had another purpose, and that purpose was really quite evil. His purpose was, as he said, and you'll see this in the documentary, to bleed France white. In other words, what he wanted to come out of this battle was not just a geographic victory with a movement into the French lines. He wanted specifically and primarily to kill off enough French soldiers. That was his priority. And he felt that the only way to move this war along and maybe end it is through attrition, by making sure that there was actually I think it was like a 3-to-1 ratio. What he had in mind was for every German soldier killed, 3 French soldiers would be killed. And eventually the bloodbath would lead to a situation where the French would have to pull out of the war. So the main priority was death, bloodshed, getting rid of the French through killing off their forces. There was a major... Is there a common question? Right, there was a major fortress. It was known as Douaumont. And Douaumont was surrounded by other French fortresses that had been built years and years and years before as a line of defense against any kind of invading army, especially the German army. So the idea was to capture this fortress of Douaumont. There was a second fortress nearby, Vaux, V-A-U-X. So there was this Battle of Verdun, and right nearby the Battle of Vaux, V-A-U-X. And it was along the Meuse Heights. The Meuse is a river, flows through northern France, and there are embankments. There are mountains ranges on each side, and obviously the army that has the heights, that controls the heights, has the benefit, right? Because you're shooting down on the enemy. So the idea was to provide enough of a force on the Meuse Heights to bleed the French army to death, just keep firing away as they tried to defend this complex of fortresses. On the 21st of February, 1916, 1,220 guns were situated around an 8-mile perimeter, and they opened fire. And it was a drenching shell storm. And you can imagine constant bombardment of troops down below. So the death rate obviously was astronomical. And the orders went out to continue the bombardment of the bloodshed and so on. The Germans managed to move about 6 miles, and at some point actually took possession of the castle, the fortress at Douaumont. But then the German forces under Falkenhayn sort of withdrew, retreated, gave the French another opportunity, and on the 14th of July, the Germans called off their offensive. That then led to, we see what the surprise ending of this battle was, but it was historically and symbolically a very important development in the Western Front as far as the morale of the French soldiers went. Another important battle, and you'll see this documentary as well, is the Battle of Gallipoli. Battle of Gallipoli was a brutal disaster for the British. And the British used other troops. You know, Britain was a huge empire. And so they had the benefit of recruiting soldiers from the various overseas colonies. And New Zealand and Australia, of course, were part of the British Commonwealth. And so therefore they had to supply troops as well. They became known as the Anzac forces. Anzac is a combination of Australian and New Zealand, right? There are also, by the way, Canadian forces that were sent as well. So the Anzac forces from the South Pacific, from New Zealand, Australia, made their first appearance in the Battle of Gallipoli, which is another battle we will see a documentary on. This battle was a disaster of mammoth proportions, with a death rate that was astronomical, and in the end, a retreat and a failure. Why was it important? What was the whole point? Remember, the alignment of countries in World War I included the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. Gallipoli is a strait. It's a straight water passage that is part of Turkey, goes through part of Turkey. The idea was to knock out the Ottoman troops, and also to force a diversion of troops from the West by the Allies a diversion of troops from the West, from the Germans, and also to engage the Austrians in this battle in the Middle East, really, talking about Asia Minor, and therefore weaken their strength. The whole thing failed because the Ottoman Turks were actually prepared for this inevitable clash, and they prepared their troops, and they had also the guidance of German generals. The German army had always been an important source of planning and strategy and preparation for the Ottoman Turks, going all the way back, long before this war. Ottoman Turkey had very close relationships with the Germans and with their war department. And you'll see some of the consequences of that when we talk about the Armenian genocide. But they were, ready for this inevitable attack by the British, and they had the benefit of controlling the heights. Again, if you control the upper heights, the upper embankments in any battle, you have a ready-made advantage because you're shooting down on troops. It's hard to shoot up. The same was true, by the way, on the Italian front. The Austrians had the benefit of controlling the mountain ranges and shooting down on the Italians. It was basically a bloodbath for the Italians. Same thing here. So the Battle of Gallipoli was a mammoth disaster with incredible loss of life and a very prolonged two-phased battle, as you'll see. But it also had an interesting and significant impact on a particular individual, because at the time, the first Lord of the Admiralty was a guy by the name of Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was the one who was gung-ho on this attack, on this battle front against the Ottoman Turks. By his catastrophic failure, that was basically almost the end of the career of Winston Churchill. He was called back. He was basically persona non grata. His career in politics was basically at its end, and he bore the brunt of the blame for this horrible catastrophe on the straits of Gallipoli. Fortunately for the world, he was a person, Churchill, who never gave up, He was thoroughly convinced of his inevitable role in history. He came from a very significant, very important family. He was the descendant of Lord Marlborough, and he believed that his fate and the fate of the British Empire were in his hands, and he never gave up. He kept involved in politics. He kept running for office. He switched parties. It was a Tory, it was a Liberal. Anything he had to do to keep his name there, and was fortunate for the world because that enabled him to become the prime minister during the period of the Second World War. And but for the foresight of Winston Churchill and his almost prophetic view of what the Germans had in mind years before World War II broke out, he addressed Parliament many times, begging them to rearm and prepare themselves for an inevitable clash with Germany. So even though the Battle of Gallipoli was a temporary setback, it was not the end, unfortunately, of his career. And then the last battle I want to mention is the Battle of Jutland, which took place on the northern coast of Denmark, the North Sea. It was the major naval encounter of the war between Britain and Germany. The bottom line really was that the Germans were held back ultimately. They kept the British at bay, but then they were, again, it was a battle without a distinct resolution or victor, even though the Kaiser of Germany felt that the Germans were valiant in their naval battle and everyone was showered with Iron Crosses and everything else, but it was really stalemate. But what came out of that was the escalation of commercial terrorism by the submarines and so on, the German U-boats that attacked commercial and passenger vessels and so on and so forth, even though the battle itself in Jutland was not really a decisive victory for either side. But remember, the Germans always envied the British Navy, and it was an opportunity for the Kaiser to show off his naval capabilities and naval power and so on. So those are the three battles I really want to focus on before we move on to the United States entry into the war. So now, first, I'm going to show you a documentary on the Battle of Verdun. Verdun. Okay. Right, this piece is known as the Inferno, and it was a burning inferno, as you'll see.
France has withstood the first shock waves of war. In Paris, the life of the boulevard, the life of the cafe, the theater, the sumptuous markets, all that seemed threatened is thriving again. The German threat, which reached to within 25 miles of Paris the summer before, has now receded into stalemate on the ground and mild danger from the air. The stalemate will be broken. The army chief, Joseph Joffre, insists on it. Ponderous, resolute, he plans an all-out offensive, unaware of an impending new shock. It is one that France will feel for generations. It will turn a French town into history's cruelest battleground, a town called Verdun. It is December 1915. Kaiser Wilhelm's German army is preparing to strike at France, this time a death blow. It has been planned by the chief of the General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, a brilliant strategist with a cruel imagination. It is endorsed by the Kaiser, It will be executed by the Kaiser's own son, Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, a sportsman turned general. To them, Falkenhayn has explained, there is ground so dear to France that to save it she will throw in every man she has. Attack this objective, and France will be bled to death. The objective has been chosen. The plan is in motion. Along a quiet 8-mile sector of the line, the Crown Prince installs an assault force. 6 divisions, 1,200 guns. Some 50,000 men are hidden deep in underground barracks close behind the front. There they will await the signal to launch the offensive, to lure the manpower of France into Falkenhayn's deadly trap. Beyond these trenches is ground that Frenchmen will die to save. If Falkenhayn is right, the objective lies in a jutting salient of the front. About 150 miles east of Paris. A place of no special military value, only the value that men's passions will give it. The objective is Verdun. Verdun on the River Meuse, a backwater of this war, a landmark of past wars. Under German siege in 1871, its citadel surrendered, opening the gates to French disaster in the Franco-Prussian War. More than a town, more than a fortress, it has become a kind of armed monument, a symbol of defeat waiting to be avenged. Its garrison of 20,000 troops, its 3,000 civilians, are hostages of their own history. Verdun's main outpost, Fort Douaumont, is the most formidable of a ring of 20 forts that surround the town. Built after the defeat of 1871, they are massive and deep and hollow. Their turrets recently stripped of heavy guns, their underground vaults nearly emptied of manpower. Defense is scorned as unworthy and unnecessary. The French High Command insists, you will not be attacked. These men have been so assured. Commandant Revillon and his staff photographed at their command post in Fort Douaumont. The time is February 1960. On February 12th, the Germans are ready to attack, but a freezing snow intervenes. The French, now alerted to the danger, feverishly work on a new line of trenches outside the forts. And the German Crown Prince notes, the god of weather suddenly deranged our plans. We were deprived of our best ally, the factor of surprise. February 21st, skies clear, ground thaw. The Germans attack. Against these waves of wind advancing behind a deluge of artillery, the French respond with what they have. The famous 75s. Accurate, fast-firing, but light and unorganized. They are no match for the enemy's big guns. The French infantry, stunned in their trenches, have learned only one answer to an enemy attack: counterattack. Ground is more precious than lives. They are met by a new, frightful weapon, the flamethrower. In 4 days, the Germans overrun the trenches. They are scaling the approaches to the forts. On February 25th, Douaumont falls. Nearly abandoned altogether by a mix-up in orders, it is captured by a single German sergeant, followed by a handful of troops. Behind the spearhead, the Crown Prince arrives to deliver his congratulations in person. A new generation of German invaders has breached the defenses of Verdun. Only 5 miles beyond Fort Douaumont, the town of Verdun is under bombardment by a huge naval gun made by Krupp and mounted on a railway carriage. The town is its special target. Before the fire lifts, nearly every building in the center of Verdun will be wrecked or badly damaged. Under pressure, Verdun panics. A frantic exodus gets underway. At headquarters of the French garrison, command is crumbling. Troops have been shelled by their own guns. A whole division is disintegrated. The reserves are being chewed up. Whether Verdun can be held seems doubtful. To give up Verdun seems unthinkable. By an order from the French High Command, yield no more ground. A decision made for the slow-moving Joffre by the Viscount de Castelnau, his second in command. Joffre sends in a new commander, General Henri-Philippe Pétain. His orders: to save Verdun. Cool and formal in manner, Pétain has the confidence of his troops, the grudging respect of his fellow generals. Among them, he is a heretic, an apostle of defense. He is careful with lies. In a single week, Pétain musters 25,000 tons of supplies, 190,000 balloons, the soldiers of France. Their route is a country road along a narrow-gauge rail track, the only road still open. France calls it the sacred route, La Voie Sacrée. It calls their mission the glory of Verdun. A British strategist, Winston Churchill, will call it in hindsight a waste and a frenzy. All during March of 1916, Verdun braces, behind artillery strengthened and regrouped by Pétain, behind forts that he is rearmed. Checked within sight of their target, the Germans begin throwing new divisions into the attack. Into the flames of Verdun, the Germans begin pouring a new kind of fuel, firing shells that release a new form of gas, a gas called phosgene, deadlier even than the chlorine they had introduced into warfare a year before. Henri-Philippe Pétain once wrote, "One does not use men to fight against materiel, but the defense of Verdun is consuming both in huge amounts. Attack is proving almost as costly as defense. 26 German divisions have shared in the burden of assault. A second fort has been captured. But Verdun itself still stands. It has only begun to exact its price." It is April 1916. To hold Verdun is not enough. Pétain is eased out, kicked upstairs to a higher command, to be replaced by Robert Nivelle, a more aggressive general, and Charles Monget, a tough commander known as the Butcher. They do what Pétain has declined to do, not merely hold, but attack. "They have thrown us into the inferno," says a diary found on the battlefield. Verdun's appetite for men, the materiel, seems insatiable. In 5 months, an estimated 30 million shells have been fired. In 5 months, 150,000 French wounded, 70,000 dead. This, too, is an estimate. Headquarters holds back the actual figures, then loses count. The lists cannot keep pace with the losses. What Falkenhayn predicted is happening. The very lifeblood of France is ebbing away at Verdun. But something else is also happening. To keep up the pressure, the Germans must suffer terrible losses of their own. It is not just France that is bleeding. The inferno must be stoked, and it consumes whatever is fed into it. The battle assumes a stubborn, stalemated life of its own, independent of all plans, futile and formless, a character of its own, which the soldiers struggle to define in their letters and diaries. "I came up as a volunteer. I wanted to see Verdun and take part in the great battle. 150 of us left the bivouac. By the time we got up to the line, there were only 30 of us left, and we had not yet met the enemy. Oceans of mud, dark skies, like Golgotha at the hour Christ died. No trenches up here, only holes, and holes blown in holes, all filled with the stink of the dead. A nightmare with no morning to come. There will be no end to this until the last Frenchman and the last German hobble out of their trenches on crutches to exterminate each other with pocket knives or fingernails. So prophesies the German writer. It is late summer. After a flare of costly new attacks that make little headway for either side, an awful calm has settled over the battlefield. It is the calm of exhaustion. It is the calm of death. The ground of Verdun has swallowed up the lives of some 200,000 men, French and German. 2 men for every single foot of front. A carnage, a debris. For the Poilu, there is one avenue of retreat, Permission, a furlough in Paris, a few days' respite from the Holocaust. To the Poilu, Paris feels like a foreign city, speaking an incomprehensible language, talking about the long-awaited offensive of July. It has finally been launched, with the British bearing the brunt of it. France can no longer afford the manpower. As for Verdun, the whole terrible truth has been erased by censorship. The Poilu feels less at home in Paris than at the front. Verdun's heroes more publicized than its losses.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here because I want to go on to the next documentary on Gallipoli, just to make a few points to summarize, what's really important about this battle. Many of the points I made, some of them he made again, but just to keep it all in perspective. Right? Well, the second year of the war, it's 1916. This is a major battle. Why is it a major battle? In part because of its symbolic significance. In 1870-71, during the Franco-Prussian War, the French lost the Battle of Verdun to Germany. Now they wanted to avenge it, wanted to avenge that loss. Didn't look so good. The first wave, the Germans basically took over. And in a strange quirk of fate, the French thought that they were surrounded in the battle in the fortress of Douaumont, but in fact, there's just one German soldier in there. But they put down their arms. They thought they, had lost the battle. Then there was a second wave, which is where we left off. In the second wave, the French come back. you have the British behind them, and actually the French managed to win the Battle of Verdun, which for them was a major symbolic victory, right? Now, all these years after the Franco-Prussian War, they've had their own victory in that fortress town of Verdun. I mentioned last time, I think wrong, the kill ratio that Falkenhayn had in mind was 5-2. In other words, Falkenhayn said, we're going to bleed the French to death. For every 5 Frenchmen killed, we're going to have to anticipate 2 Germans killed. When it was all over with, the numbers were astronomical. We don't even know what the numbers were, as he pointed out, because the French just stopped keeping track, and every country during World War I was censoring all of their war information, and they didn't want the people back home, aware of what was going on in the battlefield. The numbers are astronomical. Hundreds of thousands between both armies were killed. In fact, so many were killed, and you saw how they were just basically the bodies were left in the battlefield and in trenches and in bomb-shelled holes in the ground and so on. So that later on they had to collect just what was left, the bones. And those bones were placed in a huge ossuary, O-S-S-U-A-R-Y. An ossuary is an edifice where they just place hundreds and hundreds of the bones, skeletons of dead individuals, because they just can't even begin to bury or even identify everyone. That ossuary in Verdun is still there. And amazingly, 100 years later or more, 104 or 105 years later, French farmers occasionally plowing the land around Verdun will hit a bone in the ground that was left from that battle in 1916, and they just add it to the ossuary. We spoke about the weapons of World War I previously. I don't know whether I mentioned flamethrowers, but you saw how they were used in Verdun. Brutal contraptions, because if they landed in or near a trench, the fire just spread all over, and the individuals just burned to death. Also, the use of phosgene, another one of those poison gases, the French introduced that at the Battle of Verdun. They mentioned the poilu, P-O-I-L-U. Poilu is the French word for basically an unkempt peasant-like person, and that's how they refer to the French army soldiers, because they were obviously not able in the course of war to remain well groomed and clean and so on, and so they were known. The French soldiers were known as the poilu, the mangy, unshaven, long-haired individuals that fought. So that's what a poilu is, and they were. That was the name that was given to the French military forces in World War I. Now we're going to go on to the Battle of Gallipoli. Again, a brutal encounter and a massive defeat for the Allies.
Berlin to Baghdad by rail. The route of the Kaiser's pre-war ambition of extending German influence into the Middle East. Via Austria, the Balkans, Turkey. It cuts across another vital route, the Mediterranean link between Russia and her allies, France and Britain. Cuts it at the narrow Dardanelles, guarded by the Turkish peninsula of Gallipoli, and beyond it, by Constantinople. Constantinople, romantic place name, decadent capital. The Ottoman dynasty of Turkey is on the decline. The elderly Sultan Muhammad V clings to an empire undermined by corruption and diminished by decades of nationalist revolutions. Real power is wielded by a 33-year-old dictator, Enver Pasha, hero of the Young Turk movement. Surrounding him, a coterie of German military advisors, headed by General Liman von Sondern. Turkish military power will soon be committed to the war on the German side. On October 29, 1914, flying the Turkish flag, two German cruisers, Goeben and Breslau, steam out of Constantinople into the Black Sea to bombard Russian ports. With this act, Turkey has slammed the Dardanelles shut on Russia, and the Western Allies will be lured toward Gallipoli. In March 1915, an Allied armada steams east through the Mediterranean, inspired by a Russian appeal and by a mission that is more romance than strategy. Capture Constantinople. Open a new front. They have no plan except to blast their way through the Dardanelles, past the Turkish ports on Gallipoli. The same ports they bombarded a month before. It is almost clear sailing. The ports are low on ammunition. But the Allies allow themselves to be stopped by a Turkish minefield. 3 ships sink, and the order is given to withdraw. The explosions echo in London, in an outburst of argument at the highest levels of government. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, captivated by the prospect of a second front, is determined that the Dardanelles should be the target. Futile without soldiers, says First Sea Lord John Fisher, Churchill's outspoken confidant and reluctant ally in the venture. The War Minister, old hero Lord Kitchener, is uneasy at first about diverting troops from the Western Front, but now takes up the cause of Gallipoli. The British War Council, headed by Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, is finally persuaded to endorse a new and grander enterprise. Combined operations, troops, and the fleet. The Allies begin to organize an amphibious assault against Constantinople by way of Gallipoli. Reconnaissance. From Allied ships and island bases in the eastern Mediterranean, a crude aerial survey is launched over a hostile peninsula. Rugged, trackless, unfamiliar. This sketchy intelligence is backed up by little but travelers' guidebooks, bought in the bazaars of Egypt, where the force is assembled. The Anzac Corps, Australians and New Zealanders. 2 British divisions. A division of French. Raw troops bolstered by a peculiar exultation. A sense of unique adventure. Gallipoli fever. Gallipoli fever, fed by schoolboy memories. The Dardanelles, the Hellespont of Greek mythology near the site of ancient Troy. Oh God, I have never been quite so happy. I suddenly realized that the ambition of my life has been to go on a military expedition against Constantinople. The author of those words is Rupert Brooke, England's young poet soldier. The dream will end unfulfilled on a Mediterranean island, where Brooke dies of blood poisoning while the expedition is still in rehearsal. units practice their role in the D-Day plan. A commando raid against the Asian mainland. A bluff to divert attention from the main attack against Gallipoli. Three urgent weeks of preparation, and the expedition assembles at the jump-off points, the island bases in the Mediterranean. It is a venture remarkable for its vast scale, its ambitious aims, its innocence. A flotilla of 200 ships, loading 75,000 troops, 1,600 horses and mules, tons of arms and supplies, all headed toward a target of unknown hazards. By the evening of April 24th, 1915, the entire invasion force is underway. Its British command troubled by doubts, knowing that the enemy is prepared for them. The fleet commander, Vice Admiral Sir John de Roebeck. In overall charge, General Sir Ian Hamilton, poet-philosopher, old comrade of Lord Kitchener. Directing his assault forces are two Empire generals, Sir Aylmer Hunter Weston, commanding the British, Sir William Birdwood, heading the Anzac troops. The plan is complex. Two mock attacks, the French raid on the Asian shore, and another far to the north. The two real blows will fall in a five-pronged landing by the British on the tip of Gallipoli, and another 13 miles up the coast by the Anzacs. Winston Churchill will later write, "To land a large army in the face of a carefully prepared defense and modern weapons was to attempt what had never yet been dared, and what might well prove impossible." Gallipoli, the tempting yet forbidding flank of the Dardanelles. Gathering around its targets, the Allied invasion fleet will be ready to sound its deadly overture in the dawn of April 25th, 1950. On shore, the Turkish defenders, long forewarned, are prepared at some points, surprised at others. But everywhere, the landing craft nose into a shoreline whose hostile terrain puts the attacker at a handicap. And the odds are compounded by inexperience, by faults of communication and flaws of command, by bad luck, and by error. At Cape Helles, in some boats, every single man is hit. Up north, the Anzacs are put ashore a mile off target, at the foot of unexpected cliffs. They charge into overhead fire from a Turkish regiment. Assault troops struggle toward the heights. Reinforcements are pinned to the beaches or wait idly for orders to advance, orders that never come. Their generals in ships far offshore have no clear picture of the situation on the ground. The commander of the Turkish army, German General von Sanders, sends troops blundering off toward one of the decoy attacks, but is saved by the decision of his subordinate, Colonel Mustafa Kemal, who will one day rule his country as Ataturk. Acting on his own, Kemal throws his reserves into battle with words that become legend. I don't order you to attack, I order you to die. Their objective is a crucial ridge, a vantage point commanding the whole southern end of the peninsula. While the Turks entrench along the heights, the Allies will be forced to dig in on the slopes and on the beaches. The new front, remote, exotic Gallipoli, is only a repetition of the Western Front. Defense prevailed at a terrible cost to both sides. Instead of a peninsula, the Allies have captured only two tiny beachheads, which they cannot link up. A few square miles at Cape Helles. At Anzac Cove, a matter of yards. The litter of invasion includes 20,000 men, dead and wounded. More casualties than in the D-Day to come, a generation later. And instead of victory in a matter of days, they are faced with stalemate that will drag on for months. On the cramped, listless beaches of Gallipoli. Stalemate on Gallipoli. Troops languishing in the Mediterranean heat. Monotony, frustration, and new forms of Gallipoli fever, malaria and dysentery. First Sea Lord Fisher has already pronounced the epitaph. Damn the Dardanelles. They will be our grave. In London, the War Council reacts to the shattering news. Fisher resigns as First Sea Lord. In a secret letter, declares that Churchill is leading them all straight to ruin. The letter goes to Conservative leader Andrew Bonar Law, who now tells the government his party can no longer trust Churchill. He must go. A coalition cabinet must be formed. Churchill begs Fisher to stay on. Fisher tells him, "You are bent on forcing the Dardanelles, and nothing will turn you from it. Nothing. I know you so well. You will remain. I shall go. Both will go." Prime Minister Asquith bows to Tory demands and sacks Churchill. His political career seems at an end. "They never fought it out to a finish," he says in parting. "They never gave my schemes a fair trial." A troubled Kitchener must now decide: withdraw or pour in fresh troops and fight on at Gallipoli. He decides to mount a new attack. The public knows little or nothing of the desperate situation. There is still no draft in Britain. The enlistment campaign has stepped up. In June and July 1915, the British sent 5 divisions, nearly 50,000 men, to reinforce the 8 divisions now on the peninsula. The new men are untried and unprepared for the grim realities of Gallipoli. With this force of 120,000 and the bold, imaginative invasion plan, Hamilton will try to snatch victory from defeat. The plan: two-pronged attack. At Anzac Cove, its force secretly built up, and a few miles north, a new landing in Suvla Bay. The two forces to join, severing the peninsula and securing the heights commanding the straits for the fleet. August 6, 1915. The landings are brilliantly executed. The surprise at Suvla complete. And the result is another disaster. 1,500 Turks with a few howitzers hold off 20,000 fresh British troops. Some British boldly strike inland, but others are not told what to do. Many just sit on the beaches, brewing tea. Communications disintegrate. Initiative bogs. Old, cautious generals vacillate. A ghastly inertia settles over Suvla Bay. Exploiting the delays, the Turks, led by Mustafa Kemal, bring up reinforcements. They attack. The Allies lose 45,000 men in 10 days. The Turks, 40,000. There are so many wounded, private yachts from Britain are pressed into service to aid evacuation. The Allied gains are brushed off by one general as 500 acres of bad grazing ground. Public knowledge about Gallipoli depends upon 3 newspapermen, all heavily censored. A Reuters man so nearsighted he can only see 100 yards. A London Daily Telegraph correspondent, Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, who goes home to demand the true story be published. And an Australian journalist, Keith Murdoch, who writes a letter which gets into the hands of Prime Minister Asquith. It condemns the whole campaign and its slaughter, which is filling the quiet islands of the eastern Mediterranean with Allied war dead. On October 15, 1915, Hamilton is recalled by Kitchener under mounting pressure from the government. He leaves behind a rotting army, adrift and suffering on Gallipoli. He is replaced by a stern, pro-Western front officer, Lieutenant General Sir Charles Monroe. His immediate recommendation: evacuate Gallipoli, even though he estimates it will cost 40,000 more men. In November, Kitchener himself visits the front. Hero of Khartoum and the Boer Wars, his reputation now damaged, he at first views evacuation with alarm, soon comes around to endorsing it. Now it will be full-scale withdrawal from Gallipoli at whatever cost. 8 months after D-Day, this is all of the ground 500,000 Allied troops have been able to win. Half a million Allied troops were committed. Half were casualties. The Russians are still shut off from the Dardanelles. The evacuations, expected to be the final tragedy of the campaign, are instead a military miracle. Under the Turkish guns, the entire force, 118,000 men, is removed. Not a man is lost, not a man is left behind. It is the crowning success to failure.
Okay. Okay, a couple of points on Gallipoli. That was, as I said, a monumental disaster with an incredible loss of life and almost the end of the career of Winston Churchill. I should have been a bit more clearer and specific. Gallipoli is the peninsula. The waterway that runs by are the Dardanelles. Dardanelles are very important because they provide the pathway from frozen Russian ports to warm water ports. Allows the Russians to move their troops in naval formation into warmer waters of the Mediterranean, but the Turks blocked them. That was the whole point, to free the Dardanelles for Russian transports, because Russia, of course, was an ally of Britain and France. Very important figure besides Winston Churchill emerges from this battle, guy by the name of Mustafa Kemal. They mentioned he was the very successful military leader of the Ottoman forces during this Battle of Gallipoli. What became of Mustafa Kemal? He became known as Kemal Ataturk, and he later became the president of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, was over with when the First World War ended, and Turkey was now an independent republic, and he was the president. He, Kemal Ataturk, was really the one who modernized Turkey. They mentioned in passing that the Turkish Ottoman Empire was a brutally corrupt and failing entity. It was known as the sick man of Europe. It was on its last legs anyway, even though once upon a time, centuries before, it was a major power with an incredible geographic empire. But over time, the corruption within the empire undermined it, and we'll hear more about that Young Turk movement when we speak about the Armenian genocide. But he, Ataturk, Kemal Ataturk was the hero of Gallipoli. Later became, as I said, the president of Turkey after the war, and he was the modernizer. He really made Turkey a Western nation. Unfortunately, it's gone a bit backward now under Erdogan. They mentioned also the allure and the mystical element of Constantinople. So Constantinople the name doesn't exist anymore. Constantinople is known nowadays as Istanbul. And the capital of Turkey is actually Ankara. But way back when, Constantinople was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, an incredible architectural marvel. And like Russia, Turkey actually sits on two continents. Istanbul, or Constantinople, is on the European side of the Dardanelles and of Gallipoli. The rest of Turkey is on the Asian side of Turkey. It was then the Ottoman Empire. Very interesting history in its own right. We'll get back to Turkey when we talk about the Middle East and the Armenian genocide that took place in the middle of World War I, perpetrated by the Turks, and maybe somewhat inspired by German history. Anyway, that's a topic for later on. So the next class, we're going to start talking about the United States, how the United States finally entered the war. We're sitting on the sidelines from the beginning in 1914 till April 1917, when we finally declared war. Why did we declare war? That's coming up next. And that will be followed by the war in the Middle East, which is a fascinating aspect of World War I, and then some interesting literature accompanied by movies and some interesting artwork. They mentioned Rupert Brooke, who died in connection with this Battle of Gallipoli. Actually, it was the preparatory stage. He wasn't even there yet. Interestingly, he, like many others, thought of this campaign in Gallipoli as a very romantic experience because of their connections as students, as schoolboys and so on, with the study of ancient Greece. And as they pointed out, the heliport and Troy, the Trojan warriors, a very important part of ancient Greek history, and that's all connected with that part of the world. And therefore they saw it as sort of a romantic opportunity to actually see and be transported to those places they read about as school boys when they studied ancient Greece and ancient civilization. It was anything but romantic. And unfortunately, Rupert Brooke, as you saw, never even made it to Gallipoli. He died of blood poisoning in the preparatory stages, and buried on some Mediterranean island. But he left behind some really interesting World War I poetry, and many other soldiers who did survive. One in particular who actually died, very important poet, Wilfred Owen, who died actually exactly a week before the war ended. But we do have a lot of their poetry, and that'll be coming up later on as well. And then finally, all of this artwork, much of which portrays the horror and the death and the suffering and the consequences of the trench warfare and poison gas and everything else in art, paintings and sketchings and lithographs and everything else. So that's what's coming up next. Just to finish off, I realized I raced through this. I'll just summarize quickly these three battles next time we meet on Tuesday. And I will also be sending you an announcement regarding the midterm, which I'll probably open up on Monday. You'll have 2 days to answer to get it back. And I'll provide you with all the information I hope you need. But if you have any questions, always feel free to email me and I'll get back to you. So have a great weekend, stay safe, and see you all on Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock. Same time, same place. Are there any questions at this point, though? Anyone? Okay, again, I will. Yes, question?
I have a question about the midterm.
Sure.
It's based on the lectures. It's on the PowerPoint.
Right. Well, the PowerPoints are just like a brief, heading for the lectures. But yes, there'll be no information, or no questions, shall I say, no questions on the midterm other than what I've discussed on the lectures and what was in the reading assignments. The lectures, I told you, unfortunately, because of overcrowding of all this material, I've had to eliminate the folders, the files were full. However, the audio section of, I believe the audio sections of the lectures are still there. So you can't see the visuals, but you can still hear the lecture under audio. And all of these documentaries are on Blackboard.
Yes.
So if you want to see them again, they're also available.
Yeah, but for 14, 15, and 16, I think for the lectures, I can download. I don't know why. But I think I mentioned it before last week. I
Oh,
sent
so,
an
all right, send me an email. I think what happened was they might have been deleted, but not the audio. You can hear them, you just can't see them.
Yeah, because they show me the screen is the the play for playing, but I can't hear anything. So
Oh, all right, so send me an email. That shouldn't be the case. You should be able to hear them.
okay, thank
And
you.
I'll get back to you. Okay, any other questions? Please, I'll get back to you. All right, see you on Tuesday.